Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight. This is a collaboration, this event. It's part of a series of events that are being hosted by the Institute for Public Policy Research, which is actually my first proper job out of university, and here at the Conduit Club. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name's Sonia Sodha. I'm chief leader writer and a columnist at The Observer. I've also worked for the Labour Party in the past, including at the same time as Tom. We are here to talk about Tom's excellent biography of Keir Starmer. Tom Baldwin, he's a former political journalist for The Times. He was Director of Communications for Ed Miliband back when I worked for Ed Miliband as a baby little policy advisor. And he is, of course, the unauthorised biographer of Keir Starmer, but he's somebody who's had fantastic access to Starmer, and I think that really shows in the book, which has had rave reviews, actually, from across the press. So it's available to buy at the back. I do recommend you look at it. He's also got another book out, but he's going to tell us about that when we come to him. We've also got Harry Quilter-Pinner, who is the Director of Research and Engagement at the Institute for Public Policy Research. And I've known Harry for a few years now, going back, because of the sorts of issues I write about, including health and education. And Harry, those are some of the areas that Harry's worked on. So it's really great. This is actually the second event in a row I'm doing on what kind of Prime Minister Keir Starmer will be. Last night, it was a book launch with Will Hutton, and Keir Starmer was the actual surprise guest. Today, we've got Keir Starmer's biographer. I'll leave it to you to decide whether that's an upgrade or a downgrade. But what we're going to do, first of all, is we're just going to kick off with 5 minutes each from Tom and Harry. Tom's going to tell us what he learned from writing a book about Keir Starmer. And then Harry is going to reflect on some of the challenges facing that would face a Labour government. And then we're going to do a little bit of a chat, the three of us, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from you, and we're going to wrap up by 7 o'clock. But first of all, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and hello, everyone. As Sonia said, I'm here to promote not one but two books. And this is a very privileged audience in that it's the first opportunity anyone has had in this country to get their hands on the next book I've done, which is called, I've done it with Mark Steers, the brilliant Mark Steers, and it's called England, 7 Myths That Changed Our Country and How to Set Them Straight. And I'm not doing a sort of buy one, get one free offer. You're going to have to pay for both of them if you want them. Because we have to keep this industry that we call publishing alive somehow. I think one of the ways of looking at what the next Labour government might do is by asking a very simple question of what is the problem they're trying to solve? Or to put it more politically, what is the story that gets written into history about why, if Conservatives lose, why they lost? Now, the Tories have always been really good at this sort of thing. They've done it very effectively twice in my lifetime. 1979, Thatcher, that story of the dead going unburied in the streets during the winter of discontent. That informed so much of what Thatcher did over 3 terms of government. These narratives are really important. They did it again in 2010. The idea that Labour's spending on schools and hospitals in the UK somehow made the Lehman Brothers go bust in New York. That got sort of driven into the nation's psyche very cleverly by George Osborne and David Cameron, and that informed austerity over the next 6 years. Now, what could it be this time? I mean, Labour's not very good at this. At the moment, what you've probably got is Tory incompetence and sleaze. Now, it could be, you could have talked about Brexit, you could talk about austerity, but I'm not sure that Labour is going to be able to do more than mitigate those two decisions. So I'm not sure that can define what Labour's trying to solve. But if you're just stuck with Tory sleaze and incompetence, you haven't really got much more than what Tony Blair had in 1997. And that really didn't outlive New Labour's own sleaze and incompetence, because there's always sleaze and incompetence. So part of the reason why I think it's difficult to define what that problem that Labour's trying to solve is Keir Starmer. Because he's someone, and I know is probably better than anyone having spent a long time with him trying to work out his story, and it does sometimes take a book. He's someone who instinctively, even stubbornly, defies and resists definition. Now, there was a moment at the party conference last year where he said this: "Change a country is not like ticking a box. It's not like the click of a mouse. Long-term solutions are not oven-ready. If you think our job in 1997 was to rebuild a crumbling public realm, that in 1964 is to modernize an economy left behind by the pace of technology, in 1945 to build a new Britain out of the trauma of collective sacrifice, pause, then 2024, they have to be all free." All free. Now, I was standing there listening to this with some of his team. And a few times at football matches, in rather embarrassingly, the recent past, I've been that person who tries to start a chant, and you realise, in fact, you're the only one doing it. And you then have to make the decision about when to stop, when to
Sounds like Blur at Coachella.
I mean, and I suddenly realised I was the only one clapping. And the reason for that is, like all political people, Keir's own team want to define him in a single sentence. One of those three-word slogans: take back control, not the few, strong and stable, get Brexit done. And the last two haven't really worked out great. And Keir, I don't think, can be summed up in a single sentence. I think there will be a three-word slogan probably, but it won't be very good, and it won't sum him up. But I like the complexity, because the challenges facing this country are complex, and so are the solutions. And so, I think, is the political leader who can most effectively begin to tackle them. Now, this brings me to the other book I've done, which is behind you, and you can buy it at the end of this. Because I think it's contiguous with the Starmer book, because it's about the overinflation of certain myths about this country, the politicization by populist politicians that have got in the way of the real stories of this country, the real people, the stories rooted in real life. They've got in the way of progress. I'll give you, each chapter revolves around a different place. I'm just going to give you one very quick example. So one of them is Plymouth. And that's a great story about Drake and the Mayflower and buccaneering and swash and buckle and daring do. It's also about slave trade. It's about subjugation of Aboriginal people, piracy, and much else besides. Now, we need to come to terms with those stories and tell them properly. You don't want a single version of that story inflated up into some grotesque Johnsonian idea of global Britain and our future lies beyond Europe, out on the silver sea once more because we're a seafaring race. It's just nonsense. It's getting in the way of making progress. But a country like Britain should have a relationship with the wind and the sea. We have a very long coastline, and we have an even longer maritime history. So what do we do with that relationship with the wind and the sea? Well, look at what Plymouth University does. It's the world leader in the technology for floating wind farms. That's a relationship with the wind and the sea that's relevant to the future of this country. That's relevant to independence, security of this country. That's relevant to the challenge of climate change. And so I think that's just one example of what might emerge as a sort of Starmerism. It's about pragmatically radical decisions, not pretending it's about swash and buckle, but trying to fix problems and tackle opportunities and take opportunities one by one. It's less grandiose, it's less spectacular, it's less populist, it's more complicated, more ambiguous, and more nuanced. So the question about what is the problem the next Labour government might be trying to fix could be this. It could be ending an era of monstrous simplicities, ending an era of short-term, politically driven, sticking plaster politics, and replacing it with politics that looks and feels more like the people it's meant to represent. that bends into the folds of this country like our winding rural roads. A politics that, like common law, and Keir Starmer is a lawyer, which is based on precedent, evidence about what works, about values, rather than some phony, towering principle. But it's also about what happens to the Tories next, if they lose the next election. Because I think all signs are they're going to go off even further, even deeper into the batshit crazy marshlands of the fringes of politics. A mixture, driven by a membership dressed in a mixture of tweed and latex. So maybe the answer about what the next Labour government are trying to solve, maybe it's actually the Conservative Party and Conservative government, because that's what they've become. They used to be the grown-up party of the national interest, and now they don't represent that. That seems to be an opportunity for Keir Starmer to occupy.
Thank you, Tom. That was a fascinating insight into the mind of Starmer. Harry, next I'm going to come to you. It's often said that what Labour would inherit if Labour wins later this year is nothing like the inheritance in 1997. And in fact, we had a bit of a pessimistic conversation about what Labour's inheritance would be last night. So it'd be great if you could just set out what you think some of the biggest immediate challenges are going to be for a Labour government and for Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
Of course, yeah. I'll touch on that, and I also want to say a bit more about what is emerging as the Starmer project, such as it exists. And I know he doesn't like, that's not his way of looking at the world, but and what, therefore, a Labour government might look like. So in terms of the inheritance, I think you're spot on, Sonia. The context, as Labour continually remind us, because if 1997 was things can only get better, I think we're now in a kind of more everybody hurts moment, and Labour continually bang on about that because that's their diagnosis of how the country feels. And I think domestically we see that in stagnant low growth, in wages that have not gone up for a long time for many people, public services. We did a project earlier this year, looked across the public services. Almost all of them require over a decade of improvement at the historically top rate of improvement we've ever seen. So if you look at the NHS, the fastest at which waiting times have come down, if we replicate that again in the next decade, it will still take over 10 years to get back to where we were at the end of the new Labour era. So the scale of the challenge is huge. If you layer on top of that the international context, in which populism and nationalism is on the rise globally. The kind of global rules-based system, as it's called, the institutions and the systems that we've put in place to try and cooperate internationally, they are fragmenting. And I think one of the biggest questions that hangs over a kind of potential Starmer government is what happens in the US later this year. I think if Biden wins, there will be potentially a progressive in government, both in the US and the UK, and they will feed off each other in helpful ways that will push the creation of a new project. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. If Trump wins, I think not only are the challenges that UK and Europe and a lot of countries face, they'll go up, but I think Starmer will feel very lonely. I think you'll also see that Schulz in Germany is going to struggle to get re-elected. Albanese in Australia is also struggling. So I think you'll find that Starmer feels very lonely, is carrying this flag of both progressivism and anti-populism at the same time. And in doing that, will probably end up, and my fear will end up looking more like a Macron or a Trudeau government than a Biden government, for example, on some of the economic policy. So I think the challenges are huge, and that is in part why I think Starmer has struggled to outline the vision thing, as George H. Bush called it. And I know that Starmer doesn't like the idea of a vision, but he may not like it, but people in the country want to know what kind of country they are looking forward to if they vote Labour, and that's a very fair challenge to any political party, I think. And I think they've struggled in part because I think there are some things in your biography highlights these really well. You know, he hasn't been in politics forever, and therefore he's not been indoctrinated into a political faction, which comes with a ready-made set of assumptions, views of the world, policies that you don't need to really think through yourself. You need to tweak for the context. He hasn't got that. He borrows from all of them. He is pragmatic, and there's a political strategy which is around pragmatism. So you talk about the fact that he responds to the people he's trying to persuade. So when he's trying to win the Labour election, leadership election, he pivots to the left. When he's trying to win the general election, he's going to pivot to the centre. There's a pragmatism, which means that he's almost deliberately leant away from creating a vision. But I think there is a wider structural challenge that has underpinned that, which is, one, he's trying to do, in his own words, what Kinnock, Smith, Blair did, but in 5 years. That is, he's trying to change the party, expose the government, but also come up with what Labour's alternative is. And that took 10 years. IPPR was part of that process of coming up with what is the new centre-left answer to a whole set of problems. It took 10 years of work, not just at IPPR, but across the intellectual space, across the political space. He's trying to do that in a short amount of time. But he's also trying to do it in a context where all progressives globally are struggling. It's not like Schulz or Albanese have a clear project that Starmer can copy in the way that, in many ways, Blair stole from Clinton. Biden maybe has got the start of a project that you can see, and I think Labour have stolen from that. So Securonomics and Bidenomics share a lot in their kind of approach, but it's incomplete. It doesn't copy over as easily to the UK, and if Biden loses, I think the momentum will drain away from it. So I think there's a lot of reasons why he's still kind of grasping for this vision thing. I think there's the start of the underpinning of that. The missions give you a sense of the goals that he's looking at, and I think this story about a more active state that's trying to create jobs, I think Ed called it pre-distribution, but trying to prevent inequality by creating an economy that's hardwired for justice rather than waiting for the inequality to occur and then redistributing. There's the start of this kind of story, and a set of policies that underpin it, but it's very nascent, and I think there's still probably quite a lot of work to persuade even the people in this room who are probably, I'm guessing, slightly more sympathetic to a Labour administration, slightly more informed. Even persuading this group that there's a kind of coherent strategy there is going to be hard, let alone the general public. So there's still a challenge.
Thank you for that, Harry. So, Tom, I want to ask you first. So, I mean, on the one hand, when you're looking at Keir Starmer, I mean, it's just absolutely extraordinary. 2019, Labour suffers its second worst election defeat since the 1930s. No one thought Labour could win. Now it's like literally everyone thinks it's his election to lose. So on the one hand, that's incredible. On the other hand, I want to put to you what some of his critics say about him, which is that they're not clear yet, coming back to what Harry was saying, on what his like strong motivating force would be as a Prime Minister. And I've been listening to Louise Casey's fantastic Radio 4 series on Fixing Britain, and what struck me was on her episode on homelessness, she talked about how, during Tony Blair's first term, ending Ross sleeping was one of his key priorities. Everyone in the cabinet knew it. Everyone knew that she, and I think it was Hilary Armstrong, although I can't remember which cabinet minister it was, had his backing. And, and it was like literally everyone knew that was one of the reasons why Tony Blair got out of bed in the morning. And so I guess my question for you is, Keir Starmer better than most people now. What do you think, I'm sure there's that motivation there. What is it?
I think it is a set of values which, most people have values, but if you ask people to codify them, they'd struggle. If you ask people to place them on some ideological spectrum, they would struggle. But Keir does have values. There's a whole section in the book called Footballism. And, people laugh at that, but it is actually, there's collectivism in there. This is how a very tightly bound person can actually let go sometimes. When Arsenal score a last-minute winner, he talks about that as a magnet in the sky, lifting us all up simultaneously. There's communitarianism in there. He talks a lot about how small football clubs play a huge role in communities. It's also about how he operates as a team. A lot of his values are based on his childhood. I think, he's the first Labour leader for a very long time to talk about class and snobbery. That's because of what his dad experienced. He was a toolmaker. He studied 8 years to be a toolmaker. And if you grow up in Surrey, they don't really know what a toolmaker is. In Burnley and Bolton, being a toolmaker means something. Not in Oxted, Surrey. That just meant you worked in a factory. And so he has this thing about respect and snobbery. And, when he talks about breaking the class ceiling, that's one of his central missions. And that goes very, very deep in him. And we may come on to Israel Gaza later, but when he went to see Zelensky in Kyiv, most of the conversation was Zelensky asking his human rights lawyer for advice about how to prosecutions of Russians for war crimes. He remembers watching the fall of the Berlin Wall on a rickety TV set in his flat, which was above a brothel, and seeing hands reaching out and touching hands from across the other side, and thinking that this was a huge triumph of democracy and human rights, and we're never going to see it again. So when he talks about facing down the threat of Russia, he really means it, because it's based on these values about human rights and the sense that in this part of the world, at least, there had been something he thought was, we'd won. And he was, the shock he had when he saw Russian tanks rolling over the borders of Ukraine again was very deep and profound. So yes, he has values, but you're right, he doesn't like the word vision, because most people don't have visions. If someone stopped you in the street and said you've had a vision, you'd direct them to the hospital, not towards Downing Street, right? He has values, but it's a practical expression of those values. And his missions are very personal. They're a sorting mechanism for getting closer to good outcomes, but it's not one single big radical idea which is going to transform everything. And I think that sort of politics just hasn't served us very well. It's going to be taking a series of steps, sometimes unglamorous, without generating any headlines, towards getting towards a better place. Now, you're right again, the challenges facing him are enormous, and he may be overwhelmed by them, but I do think there's just a chance of a pragmatically radical way of doing government which would be transformative compared to what we've had in the recent years.
And Harry, I want to come to you and ask you about growth, which is absolutely key. I've read Rachel Reese's Mace lecture. People in the audience may have read it. And I have to say, I completely agree with her diagnosis of the massive structural issues that the UK faces going forwards. But I think I read the prescriptions and there's some big question marks there, because essentially what she's telling Britain is, we will grow the economy, and that's the way we're going to have more, that's the way we're going to fix the NHS, and how we're going to make sure schools get the resources they need, etc. But when you look at Labour's investment plans, their green investment plans, for example, where their plans now stand, it's a little bit higher than the Conservatives' public investment plans, but not that much higher. And public investment, a lot of people think, is the way to grow the economy. So I think there's a big question mark there, isn't there, which is, if you scale back your green investment plans, if your plans for public investment are only slightly higher than the Conservatives, if you tied yourself actually to the Conservative macroeconomic worldview and to the really tough spending cuts that Jeremy Hunt kind of loaded onto the Treasury after the election, where is the growth going to come from? How is Labour going to deliver it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the missions are really interesting, because that was Keir's attempt to do the third thing he said he needed to do. He said he needed to change the party, expose the government, and then, if not them, why us? The third question, the vision point. And the missions were his attempt to respond to that. And I think for most people, they felt a bit underwhelming. I think most people in the electorate probably don't even know they exist. But when you look at the detail of them, they're actually pretty bold. I mean, I was going to say more savvy politicians, very savvy politicians, but they're very risky. I don't think Tony Blair would have signed up in advance publicly to those things, like halving violence against women and girls. We have no idea how to do that. The carbon targets, most of the sector feel that they are impossible to deliver. And the growth one, it's out of their control because it's a relative target, so it's completely out of the control what happens in the rest of the G7. but also it would be a massive uplift in growth in a country that's only our growth trajectory's only gone one way. So I think they're an interesting, pointed to the fact he could be quite radical. He's going to need to be to meet those targets, but they don't really sound that exciting. On the specific question that you asked, I think, I agree with you. The diagnosis is right and the prescription is as yet a little bit weak. And there's a lot pinned on it. And I think in part they've come up with that answer because it's a solution to a political problem. The political problem is they feel they cannot move away from the Tory spending plans without being attacked in the kind of Neil Kinnock style way. They don't want to put up taxes. So what are you left with? Well, you've got to get revenue, and the easiest way, the kind of magic growth fairy is the answer. I think they had an inkling of a story that was starting to become quite compelling, which was a massive increase in public investment. If you looked at our Resolution Foundation, another ex-Milibandite in Torsten Bell, did a big piece of work on growth.
Everywhere.
Indeed. And that basically said, it's hard to understand why the UK's growth is low. We still don't really know, but the one thing we can say is our investment's really low. So they had this big investment pledge, similar to Biden in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. They said we were going to reboot an industrial strategy. The state will be much more active. We're not just going to have an industrial strategy for the city, which is what we've had for the last 20, 30 years. We're going to have an industrial strategy for everywhere and for the key industries. And that will drive growth across the country. And I think the investment, as you say, has been pulled back. It's actually declining over the next parliament because of the spending cuts on the current trajectory. And we are yet to see what that more active industrial policy really looks like. And my fear is Rachel Reeves will get in the Treasury doesn't like that kind of thing, it gets lost. Where is the growth dividend? So I think there are huge questions there that are yet completely answered. I think if Biden wins, it will push the growth story that he's taken US on further and incentivize Labour to be bolder and think bigger. If Biden loses, I'm really worried that they'll back off the investment, the active state, and we'll be left with something that looks a lot more like 1997, which is hope that the city and our service model thrives and we can reap the benefits from it.
Tom, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, well, just that it is possible to have an active state without spending lots of money. And I think the way they talk about the green investment now, they're essentially looking at industrial policy financed by the private sector rather than the public sector. But they do think by providing a stable platform, you can attract a lot more private sector investment into green infrastructure and low carbon technologies than you can with what we've had in the last few years, with the government just ducking and diving all over the place in short-termism. And so, one of the things that, a lot of what Labour's proposing, which is most radical, which I think is going to happen early on, involves not spending money. The new workers' rights agenda doesn't involve spending public money. There are changes to planning. That doesn't involve spending public money. So I think you kind of, some of the things we actually used to do when we were working for Ed Miliband, because that was a period of austerity, was looking at trying to find a way of doing social democracy in an age of austerity and looking at reforming the economy and reforming the state can actually take you to quite radical places. It's not just about the pound signs.
Thanks, Tom. There's just one more question I want to put to you both briefly before I open it up to the floor, and that's really the issue of young people and social mobility, because I look at sort of the climate that young people are kind of growing up in. They face some of the most expensive housing costs in Europe, which dampens their job opportunities. Lots of young people can't afford a rental deposit. They can't move to where the jobs are. The average graduate will end up repaying around £50,000 now in university debt. They haven't got defined benefit pension schemes. It really feels like we live in a society where more and more you existentially need parental wealth to cushion you from that. And that means a society where social mobility is getting harder. And that should be, that's the antithesis of a Labour government. That's not why people are in the Labour Party. So, but yet again, I look at Labour's offer and we understand the risk averse strategy going into the election. But it really feels like we're going to have to do something quite radical around young people and the offer for them. So I just want to ask you both, do you think Keir Starmer gets that? And do you think there's stuff in the pipeline?
I think he does. One of the central stories of Keir Starmer's life is, I think, this relationship between him and his three siblings. He was the one who went off to grammar school and then became the first person in his family to go to university. And the other three were left behind. He had a brother with pretty bad learning difficulties, two sisters who've led fairly precarious lives. And when he talks about class, he's also talking about guilt. He's talking about aspiration and mobility, but he's also talking about guilt and the sense of he left them behind and what happens to people when they're left behind. So when you talk about social mobility is great for the 50% of people who are moving and not great for the 50% of people who are left behind. And I think that he does get that, and I think it's a complicated answer, a necessarily complicated answer. The simple bit of it is this. The reason why young people have fallen behind this country more than anything else is because they don't vote and old people do. The reason why we got a triple lock on pensions, because old people vote. The reason why we had Brexit is because old people vote. And young people really care about Brexit, but they didn't come out in a referendum. Now, there's lots of ways in which the Tories have made it harder for young people to vote, but it's also about young people's connection to politics. How do you get young people who are incredibly cynical about traditional party politics to come out and vote and take part in it? Now, people talk about the youth quake in 2017. It didn't really exist. They didn't come out in 2017 either. Just some people were very hugely infused. I mean, otherwise we'd have, if you judged elections by big crowds, Oasis would be running the country, right? So how you re-engage young people, I think, is to show that politics works. Not by big inspiring speeches and big crowds and massive radical transformational offers, because they've seen that movie before and they know it doesn't work for them. I think you need to start showing results, or in one of Keir Starmer's favourite sayings, do your talking on a pitch. Actually start bringing some change. Now, wherever he can, I think is a real issue. Wherever he'll be pulled off by the demographic electoral priorities of needing to appeal to old people, short-termism, I don't know, but I do think he gets it. I think it's a central part of his understanding of the world.
Thank you. Harry, do you want to come back on that briefly?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think, this is all contained in what he calls his opportunity mission, which is about making sure everyone gets the opportunity to thrive in education, get a good job, and have the basics of, housing and kind of decent foundations in life. I think what is interesting about Keir Starmer, and you just mentioned it, is he is the first politician in ages to talk about class. You're absolutely right. And that is, I think, potentially a game changer to bring that dimension of politics back into the mainstream. If that's followed through into a policy agenda, I think you might get an answer to some of the questions that you're talking about. I know the question you're talking about is not just a class question, but it's a very strong overlap there. And I think it is following through in things like the New Deal for Workers. That is a really good example. I think if they follow that through to things like childcare, to further education, so not just having routes through education that are academic, but through then I think there is a possibility that talk about respect, that talk about class, which at the moment is a values thing and not a policy thing. It's not been followed through into policy entirely. But if you can push that through into policy, I think there is an agenda there that Starmer instinctively is sympathetic to. The question is, does he make it his priority? Is there the money to back it up?
Great. Thanks, Harry. Right, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor now. I'll take a few at a time. I'm going to go to the lady in the white there first. Thank you. Oh, I think there's a mic just coming your way, actually. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can. Yeah.
Thank you. So my name's Priya. I'm from the Equality Trust. I just wanted to touch back on something that you mentioned, Harry, when you were talking about how Keir Starmer might tackle inequalities. And you kind of seemed to intimate that he was hoping to tackle inequalities as a kind of byproduct of other policies rather than as as a fundamental inequality first kind of approach, and I just wondered if that was what you meant, and if it was, do you think that will work, or do you think there's any way that we could kind of influence a more inequality first or reduction first approach? Thank you.
Great. And do you mind passing the mic to the lady with the blonde hair there? Thank you.
Should I ask now? Hi. I want to ask about artificial intelligence. I'm the founder of Koru Kids. We're a childcare company, and I spend a lot of time with other tech founders. We're all using artificial intelligence, building on it like crazy. We see it as big as the internet, as big, maybe it's only slightly overstating, as big as the steam engine in terms of reshaping our economy very fundamentally. Is it even on the radar? Is Keir actually thinking about it and its potential, which I think is enormous?
Great. And then the person in the stripy jumper there.
Sure, hi, Philippe here in a personal capacity. I'm hearing a little bit of dichotomy here. I'm hearing Harry say that there are these missions that are really radical, that are going to require big changes, and Tom saying that, well, Keir Starmer wants to be more gradualist, he doesn't want to make big headlines, he wants to show that things are working. What's the truth behind it in that sense? Are the missions just indeed, I'm almost sensing here, paper thin to try and get people to vote? Or are there actual plans for Keir Starmer to be a radical Prime Minister, try and actually enact them further? And is it more electoral, or is it indeed based in policy?
Right. Okay, thanks. Tom, I'm coming to you first. Is there such a thing as radical pragmatism, or is it just an oxymoron?
I think there is, and I think it involves understanding what the missions are. The missions are not a policy, and they're not a pledge, they're not a target. What they are is they're meant to be a sorting mechanism and an engine within government. They're not actually necessarily meant to be great retail politics either, and I don't think they have been. There will be a retail version of them. So what it means is, if you want to get growth, growth is not the policy, it's about trying lots of different means to get there. I sometimes draw this analogy, like it feels in politics like we're stuck at the bottom of a ravine, and you have the radical politicians go, I'm a radical politician, I'm going to climb out a ravine using only my teeth, because no one's ever done that before. And the lobby go, that's amazing, and they get really excited. They're watching this guy kind of like, try and climb out his teeth, and his teeth falling out, and everything, there's blood and gore everywhere. And Starmer goes, well, why don't we try a footpath? And a footpath's blocked, well, there's another way around a footpath. And it's about trying lots of things. Not all of them will work. But AI is part of it. Of course it is. You're not going to be able to reform the health service and get better value for money out of the health service, which is absolutely central to this country's well-being and growth and everything else, without using new technology. Now, how do you harness that in a Whitehall which doesn't have that expertise is a question they're looking at. So they're looking at bringing in lots of outside expertise. They're looking at actually trying to change the way government works, so you actually use time in politics. It's about how can you actually help them get closer to achieving these missions. They're not all meant to be achieved within 5 years or 10 years, but striving all the time to get closer to those missions will transform government and will get you closer than if you hadn't set them in the first place. That's the idea.
Harry, can I come to you on the question of inequality, and then also related to that, lots of people are very worried about the unequalising impacts of AI as well as its benefits. So if you've got any reflections on Labour on that.
Yeah, so on the inequality point, I don't think the current Labour Party and Keir's starting point is we don't really need growth, we just need to work out how we share what we've got more, which would definitely be where I think a Corbyn project would probably start. And I think people like Ed Miliband would be reasonably sympathetic with that. I mean, so I think they're definitely starting from a different place. But I think if you read the details of what they're saying, and it's kind of submerged, the Mays lecture is an example, they are talking about a very different type of growth to the one that Tony Blair or Thatcher would have talked about, right? So they are talking about, they have critiqued quite actively a growth model which Blair lent into, which was basically like, you let globalization run as free as it wants, and you let the city and finance run as free as it wants, and then you just tax and then redistribute to people that are losing out from that quite exposing growth model. And we've seen what happens there. It doesn't work. That the inequality grows, huge swathes of the community feel locked out of prosperity, and then you get, I'm simplifying, but you get a surge in far-right support, and it's not as simple as that because there's culture in there, but simplifying. And I think they are talking about a very different growth model where they say, we basically need growth everywhere and for everyone, and we do a mix of very strong active industrial policy and devolution to get growth across the country, and we do workers' rights to get growth across different groups of people who are being locked out. I don't think they've followed that through to the scale of policy that would need that to actually deliver. But I think there's the potential there. And if you want to see why, if you look at the legacy of Biden so far, actually for the first time in a long time, people in the lower end of the income spectrum are gaining faster than those at the top. And so that policy is broadly working. I mean, it's very early days. It needs another 10, 15 years of that before people feel it, and you need to get rid of inflation before people feel it. But there's the start of a plan there. I don't think it will reverse the kind of inequalities that might concern me, you, some of the people in this room as quickly as we'd like, because he's not going to do a wealth tax. He's not going to do some of the things that you might do if you started with inequality as your starting problem. But I think it's got a better hope than I've seen from a progressive political party in a while.
There's just one more point on that, which is if you look at some of the central policies that they've got, which aren't necessarily about growth, there are other missions like insulating millions of homes, building 1.5 million houses. Who's going to build those houses? Who's going to insulate those homes? That's not about heating the City of London up and then distributing the proceeds. That's about actually quite, working class jobs, good jobs, skilled jobs, white van man. And so, I think there is a genuine shift in terms of the emphasis on the kind of jobs they want to create and where they see wealth coming from.
Great, thanks. I'm going to take another round of questions. So let's see. Let's go to someone at the back. The gentleman at the back there who's standing up.
Hi, it's Sean Walsh from Cancer Research UK. Got lots of questions to ask. Quick reflection, I think there is room for policies that improve people's lives that don't cost money. The tobacco and vapes bill that's going through Parliament today, which Labour is supporting, is a really good example of that. My question, though, is linked to the missions, and I think it's brilliant to have long-term, bold ideas about how we can reshape and drive the country. What I think is missing is where's the support for or the thinking around some of the emerging industries? The industries of tomorrow, life sciences and areas like that. And I feel there's a gap in some of the thinking amongst Labour at the moment about where those emerging areas are, the new white heat of technology moments. And Peter Carl alluded to it at party conference. Haven't really seen much on it, and I want to be interested in reflections on that.
Great. The lady in black here at the front.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Olivia O'Sullivan. I'm from Chatham House. Obviously, because we focus on international affairs at Chatham House, we're really curious about whether Keir Starmer has a foreign policy. I didn't mean that to be, I kind of get the thing of not setting out this really bold, bombastic vision because voters have sort of lost trust. And as you would allude to, potentially he'll walk into number 10 and we might have a second Trump term, fracturing European security, unfolding crisis in the Middle East. There's going to be a lot of problems to react to. In getting to know him, do you get a sense that he has an interest in foreign policy and that he would ever get to a point where Labour had kind of missions for foreign policy or those kinds of long-term goals?
Thank you. And then if you just pass the mic one forwards.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. A very, very simple question, and it's relating to vision. I mistrust vision, and we can blame the Tories for trashing any idea of vision and democracy, come to think of it. But on the other hand, can you win an election on nuance instead of vision?
Okay, thank you. So Tom, I'm going to come to you first on foreign policy and then the question about nuance.
So Keir Starmer is unusual as a leader of the opposition that he has more foreign policy experience than anyone in his position has had before, hasn't previously been Prime Minister. So as a human rights lawyer, he went to Africa and Caribbean and dealt with governments on trying to stop the death penalty. As Director of Public Prosecutions, he represented Britain in Eurojust meetings. He went to meet Eric Holder in Washington. He started a whole CPS program of trying to establish a rule of law in developing countries. And as Shadow Brexit Secretary, travelled around Europe trying to get a better deal, or trying to negotiate a better deal than the one we got. So he's got a lot of foreign policy experience. I think it's interesting that it appears to be, I write about this in a book, that if you think of Churchill's three spheres of influence, it is the Commonwealth, America, and Europe. And I think he was a little bit blindsided by some of the other sort of Labour tradition of developmental economics, and I think he's a bit blindsided about Gaza and Palestinians. And I think what's interesting is when he screwed up, and he did in that LBC interview, sometimes you see politicians double down behind their mistakes. But he's learnt, and he's been keen to learn. He said, look, how can I avoid this happening? What do I need to know? Who do I need to talk to? And his answer is very Starmerish, in that it's not, I'm going to now sort of posture and reclaim the love of Labour activists. It's, what is it we can actually do? What is the influence Britain has on the Middle East? Very little. So we need to find allies, we need to build our influence with allies, show that we can be a stable ally. And he's had lots of talks, from the Emir of Qatar to the King of Jordan to Jake Sullivan, who he talks to regularly. And it's about actually trying to get stuff done rather than just say stuff. And I think that's quite interesting. I mean, I think Brexit, again, is interesting because I think there's lots of, it's not cherry picking these days, but low-hanging fruit. There's things you can do quite quickly. But the big shadow hanging over this is you're right, Trump. If Trump wins, Europe could be fighting a war against Russia on its own. In that case, when Starmer's talking about a European Security Pact, that probably matters more than the single market or the customs union or any of that stuff, because Britain is actually a leading defence player in Europe, the leading defence player in Europe. So events are going to change things, and I think you're already seeing him changing. He's devoting much, much more time to foreign policy. Blair said, 5% in opposition, 50% in Downing Street. I think, given the way the world is set, it could be more than 50%. I mean, foreign policy could be what defines Keir Starmer in Downing Street, I think. And just on the question of can you win without a vision? I mean, I think he's doing pretty well. I mean, someone who is seen as boring and hasn't got a vision. I mean, 20-point lead, I'll take that. But, it's fragile, and politics is volatile, and things can change. I do think we need to get away from this idea of politics as a sort of game show spectacle. I've said this before, so forgive me if you've heard me say this before. But, Tony Blair, for his many qualities, he conjured up these visions of castles in the sky which didn't always get beyond the artistic impression. Boris Johnson gathered a huge crowd around him as he set fire to some of the things we value most. Keir talks about building blocks. He was always using building blocks, in arguments, how you do a building block of this policy. And it's really boring building blocks. If you see people fiddling around with building blocks, it's dull. And you come back a couple of days later and actually you've built something. And that's the difference. It's not about spectacle and excitement. It's about getting things done. Now, I don't know. I can't swear that he will get things done. He may be overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges, but I do think it's a very different approach to the kind of posturing radicalism that we've had in recent years.
Thank you, Tom. And Harry, I'm going to come to you on the question on industrial policy and emerging industries, but I also want to chip in with a question of my own, which is about child poverty. So we now live in a country where almost 1 in 3 children live in relative child poverty, which I think is really shocking. And if you look at the impact of Conservative tax benefit changes between 2010 and 2019, families in the poorest decile with children, that's the poorest tenth of families, they've lost £4,000 on average per year. I mean, that is a huge amount. If you're, not even struggling to make ends meet, if you're in the poorest tenth of families, it's worse than that. What's Labour going to do about child poverty, do you think?
So on the industries point, so I think because they've put growth almost as their top mission, as the central mission, I think they can't avoid this. I think they have talked about, I think the three industries they've talked about as being the most exciting on the frontier are climate, technology, AI, and health, all of which are areas where the UK could have, or already does have, some area of specialism. I think they've probably got much more detailed plans on climate than they have on AI and health, but I think they get that that's where a lot of the growth, and not just the growth, but also achieving the rest of the missions will come from. I think as we've talked about, I think there's less detail on how and what that sits under those missions than we might all like, and that there will need to be for them to achieve any of that. And I think they've also kind of counterbalanced that with recognizing that this thing that Rachel Reeves calls the everyday economy, which is essentially the argument that if we just focus on those frontier industries, we leave huge swathes of the population behind because there aren't enough jobs, even if those industries thrive, to employ everyone in the country. And so I think I'm hoping that they will be as interested in the kind of frontier of cancer research and how we get care to be a good job that many people can do, given that there's going to be a lot of need for care in the next decade. And that could be a really nice, well-paying job with respect, to speak to, Starmer's skilled point, or it could continue to be left behind and poorly paid and often low quality. And I'm hoping that they get the balance and the right between the two. On your child poverty point, I agree. Labour have committed to a child poverty strategy, but that has no form, promises, and it's not a mission, and it's some of the things that we challenged. We did an event at last year's conference, which I'm surprised we managed to get Liz Kendall to come along to, because we called it Labour's mission. Is poverty Labour's missing mission? It absolutely is Labour's missing mission. It's also the thing, if you look back at what allowed New Labour to achieve so much on education, on crime reduction, on communities, it was underpinned by massive progress on poverty, on health likewise. So they are going to have to do something on that. I think the challenge will be, how do you do that without spending huge amounts of money? And I think there's an interesting question about, could you put more of the effort of reducing child poverty on some of the other levers that you've got? So childcare, for example, where there's more public support for it, and so you can reduce the costs. Housing would be the other thing. If you look at what's driven in-work poverty over the last decade, one of the biggest drivers has been house prices rising, childcare costs rising. If you could reduce those two things, you could reduce the benefits bill, and you could also reduce, more popularly, drive an anti-poverty agenda. But again, it needs to be quite bold.
And a better functioning NHS as well as part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it takes investment, especially, actually both childcare and housing take investment. Brilliant. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the evening and the end of all these amazing insights you've been getting from Tom and Harry. But please do hang around. There's a bar at the back. There is an opportunity to buy not one, but two books by Tom Baldwin at the back. And are you going to be...
I'll even sign them.
I was just about to say,
you can buy a rare unsigned one, or you can actually have one signed if you want. Yeah.
Excellent. But all that remains to say is a huge thank you to IPPR and the Conduit for hosting us. Thank you very much to Tom and Harry. And thank you to all of you for coming along and asking such lively questions, and buy a book.
Thank you, Sonia.